Hey everyone, and welcome to today's Explainer. I am super excited to guide you through this one because, wow, we are diving into a really fascinating, high-stakes political drama. We're going to unravel a pretty spectacular political miscalculation surrounding something literally all of us do, everyday grocery shopping. We're throwing it back to the spring of 2023. This was a time when the price of politics collided directly with the price of your weekly bread and butter. So let's just dive right in and see exactly how a policy that was meant to win over the public ended up backfiring on the national stage.
19.2%. Just imagine walking into your local supermarket, filling up your trolley with the absolute bare essentials, and then getting hit with a receipt that genuinely makes your eyes water. Well, that was the brutal reality for millions of people across the UK. Food inflation was just completely spiraling out of control, hitting 19.2%. To put that into perspective, that was the highest it had been in nearly 45 years. This wasn't just some dry macroeconomic statistic, right? It was a deeply relatable, everyday pain. A real checkout shock. And it's exactly this staggering number that forced the government to step in, setting the stage for the dramatic showdown we're looking at today. All right, part one, the checkout shock and the Downing Street ultimatum. To really wrap our heads around what went down, we have to look at the pressure cooker environment of May 2023. The cost of living crisis was severe. The British Retail Consortium noted that the price of staple foods, the things you literally cannot live without, was rising way faster than luxury goods. So, in response to this crisis, Chancellor Jeremy Hunt and Prime Minister Rishi Sunak did what leaders usually do in a panic. They summoned the executives of the big four supermarkets, Tesco, Sainsbury's, Asda, and Morrison's, directly to Downing Street.
And let me tell you, the tone of that meeting was incredibly tense. Chancellor Hunt didn't mince his words at all, delivering what was essentially an ultimatum: help the British people or else. He straight up warned the supermarket bosses that the British public was losing trust in them. His core argument? Well, while energy prices were heavily tied to global markets, food pricing was a domestic issue. In his eyes, these massive retailers just weren't doing enough to shield consumers from skyrocketing costs, and he demanded immediate action.
To make his point, Hunt pointed directly across the channel to France. Over there, the government had actually struck a deal with retailers for a voluntary anti-inflation quarter, which was basically a price freeze on hundreds of essential food items. Hunt wanted this exact same model in Britain. But he paired this request with a pretty heavy threat. He went with a classic carrot-and-stick approach, telling the UK supermarkets that if they didn't voluntarily cap prices on everyday staples like bread, milk, and butter, well, the government would be forced to look at aggressive legislative intervention. Basically, play ball or we're going to legislate. To the general public, it sounded great, like the Chancellor was fighting for the little guy against big corporate business. But politically, it was a massive trap.
Which brings us to Section 2. Anatomy of an own goal. Because what was originally intended to show voters that the Chancellor was robustly fighting in their corner quickly unraveled into a very dangerous political misstep. Media and economists wasted no time labeling this entire Downing Street summit as an own goal. Now, if you follow sports, you know an own goal is when a player accidentally scores against their own team. It's a total disaster. But in the political arena, it describes a maneuver meant to show strength or gain a strategic advantage, but which actually ends up totally weakening your own position. Chancellor Hunt's ultimatum to the supermarkets fits this definition to an absolute T, and we are going to break down exactly why his strategy backfired so spectacularly. Looking at our sources, we can really break down this political miscalculation into three distinct structural failures. First up, it inadvertently acted as an admission of failure. Second, it sparked some really fierce arguments over market interference. And third, it created a massive clash with the Bank of England's economic strategy. Let's take a closer look at each of these 3 points to see how the whole policy kinda just fell apart.
Okay, so let's start with that first misstep, the admission of failure. By publicly warning supermarkets that they simply must do more, Hunt was unintentionally sending a completely different message to everyone watching. He was basically admitting that his own government's economic policy had failed to control domestic inflation. I mean, think about it. If the UK economy was healthy and inflation was properly managed, the Chancellor wouldn't need to beg grocery stores to voluntarily lower their prices, right? By demanding action from the supermarkets, he actually ended up putting the spotlight squarely on the domestic cost crisis, a crisis his own party was fundamentally in charge of managing.
Now, moving on to the second reason it backfired, it's perfectly captured in this quote from the Institute of Economic Affairs. Imposing price caps distort supply chains and can lead to shortages. Free market think tanks were absolutely furious about this whole thing. Their argument was pretty straightforward. Price caps, even voluntary ones, mess with the market. The logic goes like this. If you artificially cap the price of milk, well, dairy farmers might just stop producing as much because they literally can't cover their costs anymore. The end result? Empty shelves. So instead of cheaper milk, you just have no milk. They accused the chancellor of abandoning core conservative, free market principles in favor of socialist-style intervention.
And then we have the third, and honestly perhaps the most crucial error, which was the stark contradiction between the Treasury and the Bank of England. Just days before Hunt's summit, Bank of England Governor Andrew Bailey had signaled that interest rates needed to keep rising. See, the bank's standard tool to fight inflation is to make borrowing more expensive, which cools down the economy and reduces spending. But then, on the flip side, you had the Treasury, led by Hunt, effectively trying to force prices down artificially through political pressure. Economic commentators were quick to point out that these two forces were pulling in completely opposite directions. It sent dangerously mixed signals to the markets and, frankly, made the government's economic strategy look totally incoherent.
Moving on to Section 3, the supermarkets strike back. Faced with this intense political pressure and the very real threat of legislation, the grocery industry had a major choice to make. They could just roll over and accept the caps, or they could fight back. Spoiler alert, they chose to mount a fierce defense. And they came armed with their own data to counter the chancellor's narrative.
The British Retail Consortium fired right back at the government by pointing to their incredibly thin margins. Get this, profit only makes up roughly 3 to 5%, basically just a 4% sliver, while a massive 96% goes straight to operational and supply chain costs. The supermarkets argue they were already absorbing massive cost increases from farmers, bakers, and logistics companies, and they were passing on as little of that to the consumer as they possibly could. Basically, their defense was that they weren't price gouging. They were just surviving on razor-thin margins.
The whole industry defense is summed up incredibly well by this perspective. You can't fix a global supply chain problem with a political soundbite. The supermarkets argued that price caps are just a blunt instrument. If the government forced them to cap the price of essential items, their wafer-thin margins meant they'd inevitably have to raise prices on other, non-essential items just to stay afloat. They made it clear that global supply chain problems, which were being heavily impacted by the war in Ukraine and soaring energy costs, simply could not be legislated away by Downing Street. So all this fierce pushback ultimately resulted in a compromise, or more accurately, a counteroffer. The supermarkets outright refused to sign up for any mandatory French-style models. No way! Instead, retailers like Tesco and Asda offered targeted, voluntary price lock schemes on very specific, budget-range essentials. On top of that, they pointed out that the UK grocery market is famously one of the most fiercely competitive in the entire world, way more so than France or the US. Their argument was that this intense competition would naturally correct prices over time, completely removing the need for clumsy government intervention.
Which brings us to our final section, the final verdict. After the summit ended, the dust settled, and the headlines were written. Now it's time to look at the aftermath and summarize the short-term and long-term winners and losers of this high-stakes political gamble.
Let's break down the political fallout. For the supermarkets, well, they were the clear short-term winners. They successfully resisted government interference, kept their pricing autonomy, and really only made minor voluntary concessions. For the Labour Party, led by Keir Starmer, this whole ordeal was a political gift. They immediately weaponized the event, blaming the trust hangover, Brexit supply chain issues, and 13 years of Conservative rule for putting the Chancellor in a position where he literally had to beg supermarkets for help. And for the government, well, the media narrative shifted entirely. Instead of focusing on business greed, the press really highlighted government weakness and a fractured economic philosophy. The own goal label definitely stuck. And all the while, unfortunately, everyday checkout prices for the British public remained painfully high.
It just goes to show, pointing the finger at big business is a super high-risk strategy. If you miss, you end up scoring against yourself. Which leaves us with a final, provocative thought to wrap up today's explainer. Should the government be able to control grocery prices during a crisis, or is state intervention in the free market a step too far? It's an incredibly delicate balance between protecting citizens and preserving market stability. Definitely something to think about the next time you're standing at the checkout. Thank you so much for joining me to explore this fascinating topic. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I will catch you in the next explainer.